The most reasonable record projections for major teams is where I want to start the show, and I'm going to start with Georgia. This is not the best case, this is not the worst case, but kind of what's reasonable for the fan base down there to expect. Georgia's coming off a national championship, first one in 40-some-odd years, you know all that. This is going to be a pretty set number for Georgia moving forward. I think the reasonable expectation for them is 11-1. They're going to kind of be like Alabama from this point on. They're going to kind of be like Ohio State from this point on. That's pretty much the reasonable expectation every year. When you have the combination of a supremely talented roster and a high-caliber staff, and you've got the maximum investment, and you've got those boxes checked, not many do, but when you have that, 11 wins is the minimum expectation. And you may see them drop a game, but rarely when you have rosters like these do you drop multiple games in the regular season. And when you do, the natives will rightfully consider it a disappointment. So, we got that with Georgia, 11-1. They're going to be favored every week. So, again, when you talk about a loss here and you predict a loss, or if you do, it's never going to be about, I think that's the week in week 4, that's the week in week 7. When teams like Georgia lose, when teams like Alabama lose, when teams like Ohio State lose, it normally looks like last year when, for instance, Texas A&M as a 3-touchdown favorite took down Alabama. And what you got is you got a perfect storm of, in that case, a night atmosphere, but you got a raucous environment, and you had a quarterback do everything that he needed to do in the second half, and you had an Alabama team a little bit wobbly still on the road. That kind of stuff, that's the way you'll see Georgia lose a game. I'm looking at their schedule right now. Week 3 at South Carolina. Hardly anyone's going to predict them to lose that game. But that's the kind of game where if they got clipped at the end of the season, you'd look back and you'd ask yourself, man, how did I not take that game more seriously? So anyway, that's not a prediction. I'm just, as an anecdotal example, kind of portraying why 11-1 is a reasonable expectation for Georgia. Now, we're going to do a team that we were going to do the other night, and we have perfect reason to slide them in here tonight. What about Florida State? I'm glad we waited, actually, Jesse. I'm glad we waited about 72 hours on this because I changed my mind. I was going to go 8-4 the other night. You know what I did? I slid it down the scale a little bit, and I put the reasonable expectation at 7-5. Their over-under win total is 7, so we're erring on the side of aggression here with all of these reasonable expectations. Most of my reasonable expectation win totals are going to be overs in the betting market. I'm saying that up front. At this point, if you watch or listen to Late Kick, famously, there's a stat around FSU football where they didn't have a 300-yard passing game last year. 7 of their games were below 200 yards, so the offense was fairly anemic at times. Also, I have spelled out for you, whether it be holes on the roster or where recruiting is and the progression overall of the team, why I think a lot of what I see with them is still a year away. There's just like a bright blinking marquee above FSU football right now, 1 year away still. Not from winning the national title, mind you, but from legitimately calling for a 9 or maybe even 10-win season and being in contention for things they haven't been in contention for in a while. I look right now, we got their schedule up right now, actually. They open against Duquesne. This is one of few teams that has a week 0 game. But then they have LSU. So that's the quote-unquote neutral site game in New Orleans. But after that, if you look at Duquesne and Georgia Tech and Syracuse and Louisiana Lafayette, if I assume they win all 4 of those games, which we're going to do just for argument's sake for a moment, I've still got to find 3 more or 4 more. If you're arguing that it should be 8-4 that's reasonable for them, I've got to find 4 more wins. Now, if you're a Florida State fan, sure, you can look at a game at Louisville and say, we should win that one. Boston College comes in here, we should win that one. We'll have a puncher's chance against Wake Forest and NC State, more than a puncher's chance against those teams. Clemson has to come into Doak. Yeah, I understand how it sounds. But you guys also remember what it was like last year. So do we think we've made a quantum leap forward? Or do we think we've taken a steady, maybe a decent stride length forward? Because if we have, 7-5 is what this year would look like. 8-4, I think, would be a big success for them this year. I'm going to go 7-5, though. Penn State, next up. Let's head to the Big Ten. Penn State, I'm going to get pretty aggressive here. They were 7-6 last year. Penn State, I reasonably expect them to be at 10-2 this year. If I am a Nittany Lions fan, same theme as 2021. I think we talked about this a little bit on the Sunday show. When we were entering the 2021 season, we knew, if we were Penn State fans, a couple of things. We knew that we were opening on the road at Wisconsin, and we knew we had Auburn coming in here in week 3, and those were going to be coin flip point spread games. But if we won both of them, we could be off to the races. Well, here was the good bad of that. The good news is they won both of the games. Then the bad news is they went to Iowa undefeated, and they came back with 1 loss and no quarterback. And also Will Levis had transferred, so they really were in dire straits at the quarterback position, and then the season went off the rails. Okay, well, we got that quarterback back in Sean Clifford, and we've got a fresh start this year, but it feels a lot like 2021 because what do we have? Lo and behold, we got a road game against Purdue to start the year. We're favored by 3. Then 2 weeks later, we're going to go to Auburn, very unfamiliar territory for us on the road, and that line's like 1 either way. So another pair of coin flip games in the first 3 weeks of the season for Penn State will largely, well, I guess it'll totally spell out whether I've got a shot with this 10-2 reasonable record projection or not, because if they drop either one of those games, which I need them to be 2-0 in, if they drop either one of them, and I know I've still got to go to Michigan, I've got Minnesota, I've got Ohio State, and I've got Michigan State at the end of the year, it's going to be tough. Not undoable, but it's going to be tough. However, if you're watching on YouTube and you're looking at the schedule, imagine if they do get through that Ohio State game. If they get through October with 1 loss or undefeated, it's a whole different ballgame. But if they're a 1-loss team and they get into November, it's not exactly a murderer's row in November. They go to Indiana, then they've got Maryland, then they go to Rutgers, and then they've got a big game against Michigan State to end the season. So, number of things could happen here, but again, I told you, we're erring on the side of aggression with these expectations. 10-2, it is reasonable for you to expect that. The South Carolina Gamecocks are one of the most fascinating teams when it comes to this exercise. I was doing radio in Charlotte yesterday, and I was asked about all the local teams in and around the Carolinas, and South Carolina came up. And you know how a lot of times in college football, you can get fooled into thinking progression, or regression for that matter, is always linear. So if we're going to progress as a team, and we won 7 games last year, by the very definition of record progress, we've got to be at 8 wins or more this year, right? Well, it's not right. That's not always how it works. Progression is not always linear in sports or in life. And secondly, you are a lot of times beholden to what your schedule says you are instead of what your record says you are. The over-under win total right now for the Gamecocks, for those not familiar, is 6. I am going to make the reasonable record projection for them 7-5. And you might think to yourself immediately, well, didn't they just win 7 games last year? That would be kind of disappointing, wouldn't it? Well, let me tell you a little story. It's called the South Carolina Gamecocks 2022 football schedule. It's really, really tough. And I don't even include Clemson on the end of it. I'm just talking about their conference schedule. But they do have, obviously, the Clemson Tigers at the end. Here's what I'm looking at. I'm going to give you 4 games in the kind of for sake of argument light, I'm going to consider wins. They got Georgia State, South Carolina State, Charlotte, and at Vanderbilt. We're going to call that 4-0 for the time being. Even if we have 4 wins already under our belt here, listen to this lineup. At Arkansas, Georgia, at Kentucky, A&M, Missouri, at Florida, Tennessee, at Clemson. I was just doing a quick scan of the projected point spreads or the lines that had already been released. Guys, they could be a dog in 6 or 7 of those games. They could be a point spread underdog in 6 or 7 of their remaining games. So if we're going to get to 8-4, which is better than I'm calling it 7-5, if you're going to argue with me that it should be higher, I should be calling 8-4 or 9-3 here. You're telling me essentially they probably got to sweep Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, or they got to pull a pretty sizable upset against maybe a Georgia or an A&M, at Clemson, at Florida. All that, technically is possible, but you're looking at having to string some things together here to get above 7 wins, which was the mark last year, that I don't know is reasonable to expect. Certainly in a best-case scenario, it's possible. I don't think it's reasonable. I don't think it's fair. I'll say that much. I don't think it's fair to just start looking at Shane Beamer and saying, all right, well, if you're really the guy we think you are, 8 or 9 wins this year. If you get that done, then we know you're the right guy for the job. I don't necessarily look at South Carolina that way. So 7-5 is my reasonable expectation for them. And last but not least, let's go all the way to the other side of the country. What about USC? This is going to be a highly covered team this year. And they were 4-8 last year. So how much improvement should we expect? On one hand, we know Lincoln Riley has come in and in a unprecedented manner overhauled the roster, including at quarterback. So, if you were gonna err on the side of aggression, this would be the team to do it with. 4-8 last year, co-favorites to win the Pac-12 right now. I said 9-3 is a reasonable expectation. Their over-under win total is 9. So even by the letter of the odds makers, this is not overly aggressive. I think that you got to be careful suffering from what I call preview mag syndrome. Preview magazine season is upon us, and every time you open one of those things, after you smell it, which we all have to do, after you smell the preview magazine, then you look at rosters. Don't they look so pristine? Don't they look so great? There's not a single red Sharpie line through any starter. There's not a single torn ACL. There's not a single broken arm or sprained knee. But yet, what do you and I both know? None of those preview magazines in July ever end up looking like your actual roster does in November, which makes there to be a D word that's one of the most important in the sport, and that is depth. Does USC have the depth? According to their own head coach, Lincoln Riley, throughout spring, they view that to be an ongoing issue. That's why they've been so active in the portal. I think they had something like 60 scholarship players in the spring. They're not where they need to be yet. It's impossible, even with the moves they've made, to get where they need to be. That's a multi-year process. Again, even in the portal era, that's a multi-year process. But even having said all that, when you start to look at the schedule, they open against Food, a.k.a. Rice. They go to Stanford, Fresno State, at Oregon State, Arizona State, Washington State. I'm already through half the season. They're going to be favored in every one of these games. So you might be wondering, where are they losing? Are they losing at Utah? Oh, I could see that. But then Arizona's not beating USC. Cal's not beating USC. You got to be careful talking like that. Because with questionable depth at places like corner and the offensive line, a lot of cohesion that needs to happen for you to go from being parts to a functioning machine, or in this case, a football team, sometimes if that doesn't happen on everyone's preferred timetable, some upsets happen that you didn't see coming. So I know you don't look at a trip to Oregon State right now, or you don't look at Washington State coming in there in week, 6 or something like that. No, you don't look at those games and think USC should lose them. But yet at the same time, because of the volatile nature of the style of team they're going to have this year, well, volatile in terms of potential result, it's all on the table. And then on the back half, they do have games, like I said, at Utah. They do go to UCLA. They've got Notre Dame. So it gets a little bit tougher in the back half, but even in the front half, this is not going to be a team this year where you look around in the preseason and you just dial up the W's. In years to come, we may very well feel comfortable enough with USC to do that. This is year one. In some cases, it's a year 0 because of the way they're having to hit the reset button there. But they're going to be capable of doing things this year. I don't disagree with odds makers when they install them as a co-favorite. That has a little bit more to do with the conference they're in than maybe the caliber of team they're going to have this year. They're not going to be an elite team this year. But as for expectation this year, yeah, I think 9-3 is fair because it's reasonable in that it takes into account all of the potential depth concerns if and when injuries crop up, and also just what it takes to become a team. This is not Xbox. You don't just throw a bunch of pieces in a blender, hit the button for 5 seconds, pour it out in fall camp, boom, there you go, you got a football team. That's not the way teams are formed. That's the way talent is acquired, but getting the talent versus having the team, two different things. Lincoln Riley's got to build the team out there. That's what they're in the process of doing. So 9-3, I think is pretty reasonable for USC.